This video is sponsored by Connell Guides. To get your hands on the most intelligent study guides on the market for GCSE and A-level English literature, as well as GCSE and A-level history, visit connellguides.com and use code RS15 at checkout for 15% off your order.
So in the first folio, Shakespeare's iconic play, Romeo and Juliet, is called The Tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, which might make you think that it belongs to the tragedy genre. However, is the play's genre classification really that straightforward? Let's find out.
How's it going, Revision Squad? It's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and in this video we are going to explore the genre of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. We're going to do this for three reasons. First, because it is an interesting topic. Second, because the answer is not as obvious or as clear-cut as you might think. And third, because understanding the genre conventions that Shakespeare was responding to, either by embracing them, rejecting them, or subverting them, is going to help you to understand the play better. And guess what? Get better grades as a result. Before we get properly started, you know the drill by now. Please do consider giving this video a like, writing a nice lovely comment on it, sharing it around with anyone else who you think might find it useful, and, of course, subscribing to my channel if you aren't already. All of that really lovely engagement helps me out loads, so thank you so much in advance, but it does also help me to help even more people, which would be brilliant. Alright. With all that cringy YouTuber stuff out of the way, what can we say about the genre of Shakespeare's plays and how that relates to Romeo and Juliet? Okay, so most of the time when we talk about the genres of Shakespeare's plays, we tend to use the genres used in Shakespeare's first folio to split those plays up. The first folio, for what it's worth, is the name of a collection of Shakespeare's plays that was published roughly 7 years after the bard had died. What were the genres used in the first folio, though? Well, they were tragedies, comedies, and histories. Each genre has its own characteristics and traits, which we're going to go through now in order to see if there are any we can rule out when trying to identify Romeo and Juliet's genre. So first up, let's think about Shakespeare's tragedies. They have several conventions, the most obvious of which relates to death. Tragedies tend to end with the death of their protagonists. But this is not the only way death characterises tragedies, because tragic protagonists, Martha Tuck Rozett observes, often kill other characters. Additionally, tragedies are at their most extreme when they become rituals of self-destruction, meaning that tragedies might feature characters being responsible for their own downfalls or characters committing suicide. Unsurprisingly, tragedies also contain an awful lot of misfortune. This misfortune, argues Kiernan Ryan, is partially caused by the constraints imposed by a tragedy's setting. In other words, a tragedy's society makes people miserable because they are unable to be their authentic selves. In addition to this, the misfortune experienced by a tragedy's characters has a degree of inevitability about it, argues Susan Snyder. Basically, a tragic character is going to experience misfortune, and there's nothing they can do to stop that. Now, all of this misfortune and suffering that tragic protagonists experience is designed to invoke catharsis in the audience. Catharsis is the process of releasing negative emotions so that positive emotions and pleasure can instead be experienced. Last of all, and perhaps somewhat surprisingly, tragedies do include some clowning or comedic characters, meaning that temporary relief is provided from the play's otherwise tragic content. Okay, so if that's what characterises tragedies, what about comedies? another of Shakespeare's most prominent genres.
Quick side note from me, back in Shakespeare's time, the comedy genre did not necessarily mean haha funny like it does today, and instead it means something a little bit different, which I'm about to tell you.
Well, comedies are chiefly about love, but more specifically, notes Simon Palfrey in The Connell Guide to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. They're about love that defies authority. Now, as part of this preoccupation with love, comedies often move toward marriage and usually end with characters getting married or, at the very least, getting betrothed. In fact, these marriages, Bert Cardullo points out, cause feuding families to put aside their differences and reconcile. Cool. How lovely. Furthermore, the romances that occur in Shakespeare's comedies, Palfrey suggests, feature the play's heroine freeing herself from the shackles of her family and the society in which she lives, and instead finds that she actually does have a choice when it comes to love. Finally, moving away from romance and love, another chief characteristic of comedies, Mullen discusses, is that they tend to have highly imaginary settings. Now finally, what characterises Shakespeare's history plays? Well, believe it or not, Shakespeare's history plays are about history, real people who actually existed. Furthermore, these plays are about royalty, English royalty. Former kings such as Richard III and Henry VIII are the central subjects of these plays. Although other plays written by Shakespeare are about prominent historical figures such as Julius Caesar or Antony and Cleopatra, these plays were not considered histories in the first folio. Okay, so those are some of the characteristics of the three genres listed in Shakespeare's first folio. Now, I don't know about you, but there's one genre that already does not seem to apply to Romeo and Juliet: the history genre. Even though there may be some historical basis for the story, it is not about English monarchs. As such, we're going to say goodbye to the history genre for the rest of this discussion. What we are left with, though, are tragedies and comedies. Characteristics of these plays, I'm sure you will agree, do actually apply to Romeo and Juliet. So what we're going to do now is consider each of these genres in turn and see how much they actually do apply to Shakespeare's play, which will help us to ultimately decide which genre it belongs to. Okay, so to what extent is Romeo and Juliet a tragedy? Well, to answer that question, we are going to revisit the characteristics of tragedies that we discussed just a few moments ago. So, does Romeo and Juliet end with the death of its protagonists? Well, I really hope this is not a spoiler for you, because yes, it does. Both Romeo and Juliet, of course, die in the play's final scene. Does Romeo and Juliet fulfill the characteristic that Martha Tuck Rozett identified, that its protagonists kill other characters? I would say so, yes, because Romeo kills Tybalt. Now this killing is made all the more tragic, I would argue, because Romeo does not necessarily intend to kill Tybalt. It's something that sort of happens in the heat of the moment. And it's even more tragic because Tybalt is his family member, following Romeo's secret marriage to Juliet. Does Romeo and Juliet include a ritual of self-destruction, a characteristic of tragedies identified by Stephen A. Shapiro? To an extent, yes. It could be argued that Romeo's rashness is partially responsible for the misfortune he experiences, whereas both of the play's protagonists kill themselves, a very literal sort of self-destruction. Misfortune, I'm sure you will agree, is evident throughout the play, but let's look at this characteristic a bit more deeply. Is the misfortune caused by the constraints imposed by Romeo and Juliet's Veronese setting? It could be argued, I suppose, that the family feud, importance of family loyalty, and the patriarchal qualities that characterise Verona in Shakespeare's play do hold some responsibility for the play's tragedy. If there was no feud, Romeo and Juliet could have happily and openly married, for instance, and so the tragedy would have been more or less avoided. And yes, there is something inevitable about the tragedy in Romeo and Juliet, as per Susan Snyder's argument. As I'm sure you know, fate is one of the play's key themes, and nowhere is it more prominent than in the play's prologue. This part of the play tells us what is going to happen in the rest of the story, including that Romeo and Juliet will ultimately die. As such, the misfortune of the play certainly does feel pretty inevitable. Now, does all of this misfortune invoke catharsis? Well, this is quite a subjective point. Does watching the play help to release negative emotions? I'd say so. It releases anxiety about Romeo and Juliet's relationship, builds and releases stress when the lovers are separated and a plan is made to reunite them, and sadness might be released when you see the characters kill themselves on stage. However, whether or not you find positive emotions replace those afterwards is entirely down to you. But if you find yourself relieved that you are not living under such circumstances, you are probably experiencing the full cathartic process. Now, last of all, are there any comic characters in Romeo and Juliet, or any clowning? Well, personally, I find the nurse and Mercutio to be fairly funny characters, certainly the most humorous characters in the play, and I would say that they do often provide temporary relief from the play's otherwise quite heavy content. So all in all, yeah, Romeo and Juliet does appear to be characteristically a tragedy. How convenient, that is exactly what its full name suggests. However, is its genre classification as straightforward as that? Let's turn our attention to whether or not it has any traits that belong to the comedy genre. So does Romeo and Juliet possess any traits that befit the comedy genre? Let's have a think about those characteristics once more. Because the thing is, as much as there is plenty of death and misfortune in Romeo and Juliet, isn't there also plenty of love? And doesn't that love defy authority? After all, Romeo offers to abandon his family in order to be with Juliet, and Juliet explicitly goes against her father when she refuses to marry Paris. How does marriage fit into Romeo and Juliet? Well, there is a marriage, and so you could say that it possesses a comic trait. However, you would be slightly wrong if you said that, as Romeo and Juliet does not end with marriage. The marriage instead occurs midway through the play. If anything, it's after the marriage scene where things really go downhill in Romeo and Juliet. It's almost as if Shakespeare is warning us of the perils of rushing into marriage, or it is his way of reminding us that romance and tragedy are actually pretty closely intertwined. Now, does Romeo and Juliet's marriage cause their families to put aside their differences and reconcile? Not directly. After getting married, the Montagues and Capulets are not suddenly one big happy family, although of course it would be tricky for that to happen given that the marriage occurred in secret. The family feud still stretches into the second half of the play, and so the act of marriage is not some magic wand that fixes this problem. However, it is implied that the feud is resolved right at the very end of the play, once Montague and the Capulets find their dead children and Friar Lawrence has explained, well, everything. As such, you could argue that Romeo and Juliet's marriage does end their family feud, albeit in a sort of delayed and indirect manner. In a sense, you could argue that Shakespeare is toying with this comic characteristic. However, one characteristic of the comedy genre that Shakespeare seems to maintain in Romeo and Juliet is how, as suggested by Palfrey, the play's heroine discovers that she has free choice when it comes to love. Juliet's maturation from a compliant girl to a bold and independent young woman is one of the most important elements of Romeo and Juliet, and, interestingly, it is one of the play's most notable comic elements. But you know what? Romeo and Juliet does not take place in a highly imaginative setting. Although somewhat exotic by virtue of being set in another country, Romeo and Juliet does not take place in a far-off island or in a magical forest, as many of his other comedies actually do. Unfortunately, that means that the play does not meet this characteristic of the comedy genre at all. Overall then, it appears that Romeo and Juliet does in fact possess quite a few of the characteristics that are typical of the comedy genre. Despite that, it clearly is not a perfect comedy either, as there are a few instances in which it deviates from the genre's standards, especially in how its marriage occurs midway through the play, rather than the end. So with that in mind, what can we say about the play genre overall? Well, its full title is not totally misleading. The tragedy of Romeo and Juliet certainly contains a lot of tragic elements. Characters die, characters kill each other, and characters kill themselves. There's plenty of misfortune, some of which is perhaps imposed by the play's Veronese setting, and plenty of which is inevitable. Catharsis might be evoked, depending on who is watching the play, and the play does in fact have some funny characters in it who break up its tension. However, Romeo and Juliet does also possess some comic traits. There is love that defies authority, the love inadvertently causes feuding families to reconcile, and the love is driven by a heroine who discovers that she has a choice when it comes to romance. Despite this, the play's marriage occurs at the wrong time for it to be typical of the comedy genre, and the setting is far too realistic as well. As a result then, we could say that Romeo and Juliet is a textbook example of Shakespeare's tragic plays. You could call it the epitome of tragedy even. At the same time though, the play also possesses several comic characteristics. The fact that the first half of the play is so convincingly comic, and isn't even particularly tragic either, could lead us to even say that Romeo and Juliet is a comedy gone wrong, one that mutates and becomes tragic, a profound tragedy with a comic beginning. In fact, could we even argue that the events of the play are made all the more tragic because they have such comic beginnings? And with that judgment made, I guess it is time to wrap up this video. If you have made it this far, thank you so much for sticking around and watching. I genuinely do hope that you have found this video to be useful or interesting, and that it has given you a firmer understanding of the genre conventions that Shakespeare was maintaining, rejecting, or subverting as he wrote Romeo and Juliet. Being more knowledgeable about the play genre and its broader literary context should, I hope, give you a richer understanding of the play, which in turn should help you to get those top grades. If you have found this video to be helpful or interesting at all, please do remember to give it a like, write me a nice lovely comment, share the video around, and subscribe to my channel if you are not already. Thanks also to Connell Guides for their continued support of my work. Don't forget to check out their revision guides and use code RS15 at checkout for a whopping 15% off your order. And finally, please do remember that I hope that you have an awesome rest of the day. If you are revising, please make sure to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student, which is what I think you deserve to be.
So it turns out that Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy that also possesses many qualities of the comic genre. Just like how the play features the union between two rival families, so too is it the marriage between two contrasting and often competing types of story. Cheers.